Alrighty. Well, thank you all for coming. And as I believe every one of you knows, my name is Maggie. I do the adult programming and outreach here at the Macintosh Memorial Library. And I am so excited here to have with us today. Um, and you might need to tell me how to pronounce your last name here, but Dr. Matthew Raidbard?
Raidbard. Yep.
Yes. Okay. Well, wonderful. And I will just let you take over here, and then I'm sure you have a spot for questions that people may have. And I will also monitor the chat as well. So thank you again for coming, and I'll leave it to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Maggie, for having me, and thank you to the library for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Dr. Matthew Raidbard. My book is Lead Like a Pro: Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches. I have spent my entire professional career in college athletics. I spent the first 12 years as a college basketball coach, had some time where I did that and administration, and then transitioned into full-time administration a few years ago, and have been doing that. I'm currently at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, but I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Chicago originally. My background is in education leadership. My master's and doctorate are both in education leadership. And really the kind of inspiration for a lot of the work that I do outside of my day job is my dissertation, which was on trying to determine what the best leadership style for athletic coaches to practice was. And it was really that data and that research that informed or inspired me to write the book, where I took all of that information and academic language from my dissertation and put it into a book form that I hope will help leaders at all levels of sports be able to just feel more confident and enhance their leadership practice. So the main thesis of the book and all of the workshops and everything that I talk about is the idea that coaches are leaders. And when I originally bring up this point, I get pushback, right? I get pushback from coaches who are not full-time coaches. So youth and rec coaches or high school coaches who are also teachers who, generally tell me, yeah, I'm a leader, but it's different. And, what I always say,
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. We're seeing your page that has all your slides, but not the actual slideshow, if that is different.
Hmm.
There we are. Okay,
There we
continue.
go. Coaches are leaders. Um, and I generally get some pushback on that. This idea that, coach, if it's not your full-time job to be a coach, that you're a leader, but it's different. And that's why I always start out my presentation with this concept, because it's not different. If you are a coach at any level, any amount of time that you spend on it, you are a leader. And because all of the decisions that you're making for your kids, for your athletes, for your teams are leadership decisions. And, this is kind of the second concept that I really talk a lot about, is this idea that every decision is a leadership decision. And on this one, I get a lot of pushback as well, oftentimes, but normally I get it from, college coaches or professional coaches who say, we understand that every decision might be a leadership decision, but not all decisions are made the same. And those decisions, like who we play at the end of the game and what play we run with the game on the line and what we emphasize at practice, those are actually really big leadership decisions that are really important that I should focus on as a coach. And those are important leadership decisions because they all have a lot of impact on outcomes, namely winning and losing, which a lot of coaches measure themselves by. And I completely understand that. But within all of those, let's say, big leadership decisions that those coaches are talking about, are a lot of other leadership decisions coaches are making they're not realizing or giving enough attention to. How you communicate feedback, not necessarily the feedback you communicate, but how you communicate it is an extremely important leadership decision. If you have an athlete who doesn't have a lot of confidence, is maybe new to the team, and you're continuously giving them feedback in front of their peers, they may not be responding very well to that because you're not doing it in a way that meets their need, right? So if they don't have a lot of confidence, if they're new to the team, you may need to provide feedback one-on-one in order for it to get through to them. So before we could talk about those big leadership decisions that coaches are saying about what has an impact on outcomes, we need to look at how are we communicating? How are we building relationships? What are we doing with our time in practice? Are we giving it equally amongst all of our kids? Are we focusing only on certain groups? How is that making other groups feel? So all of these decisions, whether we're making them consciously or specifically or not, are leadership decisions. And that's why, in my opinion, coaches need leadership education and training. Coaches today at all levels of sports, from the 5 to 7 year old youth soccer team that I coach for my girls, all the way up to when I was a college coach and for professional coaches, they're being asked to serve more roles, take on more leadership responsibilities than ever before. I remember, in my first college coaching job, I was an assistant basketball coach at a small Division II school down in the southwest corner of New Mexico called Western New Mexico University. And I got the job right out of college. It was a few months after graduation. I was so excited because all I ever wanted to do growing up was be a college basketball coach. That's all I ever wanted to do. I never wanted any other profession except for that. So when I got my first college coaching job, I was so excited. And I had this vision in my head of how that was going to look, what I was going to do on a daily, weekly basis, what my major job responsibilities were going to be. And I'll never forget, I was down there for about a month, and my dad called me. We were talking on the phone, and he asked me how things were going. I said, everything's great. I love the town. I love the team. I love the university. I love the coaches that I work with. Everything is great. I said, but I don't understand when I'm going to get a chance to focus a majority of my time on all of those basketball specific job responsibilities that I thought were going to be so central to what I did every day. I was spending an inordinate amount of my time in my role as an assistant coach on other responsibilities. I was a class checker, a study hall monitor, a nutritionist, a strength and conditioning coach, a friend, a mentor, a chauffeur. I was wearing all of these other hats, taking on all these other leadership responsibilities that were all important, because in each leadership responsibility, depending on how I handled it, I was having a positive or negative impact on my athletes. Even though these things didn't necessarily have anything specifically to do with basketball. I wasn't recruited. I was not spending a majority of my time recruiting or coaching on the court or designing winning game plans. I was doing some of those things, but a majority of my job was spent on these other roles and responsibilities. The problem for me, like for a lot of coaches, is when you become a coach, if you have a knowledge base to be able to coach that sport. I knew a lot about basketball. I was very comfortable coaching basketball, providing feedback, making adjustments when it came to basketball. But the first time that I had to have a conversation with one of my athletes who was missing class, I had no idea what to say. I didn't know, am I supposed to be hard on him? Am I supposed to be empathetic? Do I let him talk first? Do I talk first? I don't want to make any assumptions, but I have to go off the information that I have. I had no idea what to do. And inherently in that, as a result, I was a mess. I was stepping on my own toes. I was not making sense. I wanted to come off strong because academics is important, but not too strong because I didn't know if I had the whole story. And I made a negative leadership impact on my athlete because of how I handled that situation. And coaches are put in those types of situations constantly, more and more every single year. And that's why coaches need more expansive leadership training and education to be able to best meet the needs of their athletes and navigate all of those different roles and responsibilities that they're asked to take on. The influence that coaches have over their athletes is very powerful. In every leadership decision that coaches make, there's a negative impact or a positive impact. There is no net neutral impact. It's negative or positive. And sometimes there's a negative impact for some kids and a positive impact for other kids. So that's another layer that coaches have to navigate. Not every kid has the same needs. Not every kid learns the same. Not every kid wants to receive the same communication. Not every kid is motivated the same way. So as a coach, you've got to navigate all of these kind of twists and turns in leadership to be able to effectively try to meet the needs, the various needs of all of the kids on your team. So one thing that I learned from my research and has informed a lot of the work that I do now in educating coaches on leadership practice is the idea of the leadership gap. And this is a phrase that I coined while doing research when I noticed that there was a leadership gap that existed for coaches who were not as successful. So successful coaches had much less of a leadership gap than unsuccessful coaches. And by leadership gap, I mean there was either a noticeable gap in the leadership training and education that unsuccessful coaches had received compared to successful coaches. So coaches who weren't as successful were receiving on average much less leadership training and education than successful ones. And also there was a leadership gap when it came to coaches understanding what type of leaders they were. For the more successful coaches, they had a much better understanding of the type of leader they were, be it transformational, servant, democratic, transactional. Whereas for unsuccessful coaches, they had a much more fluid understanding of what their leadership style was, what the key behaviors were. Therefore, it was hard for them to kind of pin down what type of leader they were and then make intentional leadership choices that were reflective of who they were as a leader. So with this leadership gap in mind, that was another inspiration that coaches needed this leadership training and education to be able to bridge that gap with more knowledge and education on leadership, and then help understanding what type of leader that they were so that they could then go out, best lead their teams, and then more importantly, make adjustments as they went because they understood the intentional leadership behaviors that they were enacting for their team and what they meant for their outcomes. So how do you determine the right leadership style? I break it down in the book into 3 very simple steps. 1, reflect on and determine what are your personal values and beliefs as a leader. So for me as a coach, before I learned anything about leadership, if I was asked this question, I would answer that I always believe it's my role as a coach to motivate and inspire my athletes to believe they can achieve more than they thought they could on their own. I always wanted to build strong personal relationships with my athletes based on mutual trust and respect that transcended the typical player-coach relationship. Those were just in me. Those were central to why I became a coach, why I wanted to do this for a profession. So knowing that, once I learned foundational leadership knowledge, once I learned about transformational leadership and the key behaviors, I learned about servant leadership and the key behaviors, I was able to start having these aha moments in my head where I connected the dots. If I believe that inspiration and motivation of my athletes to help them be more and achieve more than they thought they could on their own is central to who I am as a leader, once I learned foundational leadership knowledge, I was able to connect the dots and realize that's a key component of transformational leadership. So at the core, I was a transformational leader. I also believed as a coach that it was always really important to me to develop the leadership abilities of my athletes by giving them a voice in the decision-making process. Well, I didn't know that was democratic leadership when I first started coaching. But once I started learning more about leadership styles, I realized I'm a transformational leader who prefers democratic leadership in the decision-making process. And now all of a sudden, I'm starting to shape my unique leadership practice based on who I am as a leader. And then the last part of it, which accounts for oftentimes a lot of the leadership gap, is once you know what type of leader you are, once you know what type of leadership style you are practicing and want to practice, you need the tools to be able to go out there and practice it. And this is where I always found early in my career in coaching was lacking. There were all these leadership books for business and education and other professions outside of coaching on how do you become an effective organizational leader? And there's so many principles of organizational leadership in the business world, for example, that also apply to coaching. But the main difference is that in my job in administration now, I lead coaches and other staff who are adults. In my previous role as a coach, I led 18 to 22-year-olds. Or tomorrow, when I coach my daughter's soccer team, I'll lead 5 to 7-year-olds. That takes a very different leadership practice than leading adults within an organizational structure. It can be much more nuanced. And within that, the leader that I am for my college team versus my, little elementary school team is also going to be very different because their needs are very different. So I need a lot of tools in my toolbox to be able to effectively lead those different groups, particularly when those different groups, even if you're coaching 5 to 7-year-olds, there's so many differences between a kindergartner, a first grader, and a second grader, just like there is with a first year, a sophomore, and a senior, and a grad student. So even within those populations, there's so many nuances with what their specific needs are. And that requires a really expansive leadership toolbox to be able to effectively practice your leadership style and meet all of those different needs. So a couple of things before we kind of move on to the next section, I'll talk through some different leadership styles. And hopefully, as I'm going through the different styles and their key behaviors, you'll start connecting some of those dots between what's important to you or what you do as a leader and the leadership style that they represent. So a couple of things before that. Every coach has a belief system, values, personality, set of goals, communication style that's unique to them. So even if I'm a transformational leader who prefers democratic leadership for my decision making, and you're the exact same, it's still going to look and feel different because we're different. Our backgrounds and life experiences that are informing our decisions are going to be different. How we communicate is going to be different. We're going to have different points of emphasis, different priorities within that seemingly same leadership style. That's why I always tell young coaches or new coaches, it's more important for you to look inward and do the work to discover who you are as a leader versus trying to copy anybody else. The biggest mistake that I made early on, and a lot of young and new coaches or leaders make early on, is trying to do what their mentors did or what other successful people in their profession or coaches do. The reason, a large reason why they're successful is because they've done the work to figure out what type of leader they are. And as similar as you may be to them, you're still different people. So it's always important to look inward and figure that out for yourself. Now, what they do can inform your leadership practice, and you might learn things that you want to try out, but it all starts with you first. No leader practices only one leadership style. It's common for coaches to have one or two foundational leadership styles, but also incorporate key behaviors from other leadership styles. At the core of my leadership practice as a coach, I was a transformational leader. But for decision making, I preferred democratic leadership. And at times, I also brought in some key behaviors of servant leadership, like putting the needs of my athletes first. All of those different leadership styles and key behaviors all come together to form my unique leadership practice. And you also might find that as we're going through the different leadership styles, that one key behavior of 3 or 4 leadership styles speaks to you. That's totally fine. You don't need to have a foundational leadership style in your practice. But I would just say make sure that as we're going through those leadership styles, that you're not kind of adhering to ones that are contradictory. So if you're more of a democratic leader, you're trying to get participation and solicit input from all of your team members when making decisions. Be careful about also when gravitating towards autocratic leadership, where you make unilateral decisions, because those can be conflicting leadership styles and they can confuse your team if one day you're more democratic and the next day you're more autocratic. And then the last thing is your leadership style is fluid. It's going to constantly change and evolve as you change and evolve as a coach and leader, but also as the needs of those that you're leading change and evolve, which that could be week to week, year to year, but all of those needs are constantly changing and you're constantly changing. So be fluid in your leadership practice. So what this comes down to is being able to make intentional leadership choices. This is what I hope for every coach is you learn foundational leadership knowledge, you determine your leadership style, and then based on your leadership style, you make intentional leadership choices that are reflective of you as a leader. So for example, I'm a transformational leader. I believe in motivation, inspiration, and building relationships. So I ask myself some of these key questions at the start of every season. What's important to me? What are my responsibilities? What are my goals for the team? So just kind of giving a practical example, my goal every year that I was in coaching was always that I wanted my team to have fun and have a great experience. So as a transformational leader, how do I do that? How do I make intentional leadership choices to help all of my athletes have a great experience? Well, one was I wanted to always build those strong relationships that transcended typical player-coach relationships. Okay, so I know I want to do that. How do I do that? What tools do I use to do that? For me, whenever an athlete came to my office, no matter what it was, the first question I always asked them had nothing to do with basketball. I always wanted to set this standard or this expectation that you are a human first. So the first thing I'm going to ask is about you as a person, not you as a basketball player. I always tried to share something about myself when we were having conversations. I didn't just want it to be a one-way street where I'm asking you questions. I was always trying to be willing to share things about myself, personal things about myself, so they got to know me as a person as well. And then I always tried to show up early for practice and stay late for practice so that they knew I was invested in them outside of whatever the practice time was. I'm here for them with whatever they need. So based on me being a transformational leader and it being important to me to build relationships with all my athletes, I made intentional leadership choices to come to practice early and stay late, ask them about how they're doing as people, and share things about myself so that we got to know each other on a human level. So that's kind of the process that I kind of want everybody to kind of view through as we go on to the next part of the presentation, where I talk about different leadership styles. So the first leadership style that I'm going to talk about is a really important leadership style to me, transformational leadership. And transformational leadership is really rooted in this idea of inspiration and motivation. Transformational leadership, research shows, is the most commonly practiced leadership style for coaches. And, it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because a lot of coaches, not all of them, and it's not a prerequisite, but a lot of coaches, like me, feel that a big part of their job is to inspire and motivate their athletes. How do you do that? One really common and effective way is through your communication, being inspirational and motivational in your messaging. That's extremely common. And that's going to meet the needs of a lot of your athletes in order to hopefully motivate and inspire them. But it's probably not going to meet all of their needs. So what other tools can you use as a coach to motivate and inspire? Me personally, I was not really big on my communication when it came to inspiration and motivation. And I really struggled once I realized I was a transformational leader with reaching my athletes in an authentic way. That was until I realized and I acquired the tool of behavior modeling as a really powerful way to inspire and motivate my athletes. By demonstrating hard work, commitment, overcoming adversity, taking on challenges, could be a really powerful, inspirational, and motivational tool. Because if my athletes saw me doing it, they might be inspired to then do it themselves. So that was a really powerful tool for me to be able to inspire and motivate. Some other tools that you can use is inspiring confidence. Sometimes a roadblock to athletes taking your feedback or taking your constructive criticism and making changes isn't that they're not listening or they don't want to do it. It's that they don't necessarily have the confidence to do it. I learned this when I was coaching and I had an athlete who, I really wanted him to work on his weak hand for dribbling, passing, making plays. And we'd always go through drills and he'd always leave practice and tell me he was going to do it. And then I'd see him later in the gym working on other skills that were already strengths. And I had a conversation with him and I asked him, don't you want to get better? Like, don't you want to work on these skills that are weaknesses? And he told me, he was like, working on things that are weaknesses is hard. I'd rather come in here and just enhance my strengths. And that really hit me that it wasn't just about here's what you need to work on, go work on it, right? Some kids, some athletes, they're going to do that, but others may not have the confidence to do it because it's really hard for your weakness to be exposed and then to go work on it. So, I always try to kind of work that in to make sure that they have the confidence to go out there and do those things that I'm telling them, or take that inspiration and motivation outside of practice or our interactions. Another really powerful tool for inspiring and motivating athletes is helping them have a sense of purpose. You know, Understanding what your role on the team is can be very inspirational and motivational. And oftentimes athletes who don't know what their role is, don't know what their specific expectation is, really struggle with being motivated and inspired because they don't know what they're being motivated and inspired to do. So I really tried to work hard, to make sure that everybody had a role and everybody understood the importance of that role towards the totality of the success of the team. Everybody wants to score points. Totally get that. Not everybody can score points. It's not everybody's strength to score points in basketball. But we need people to pass the ball and play defense and be good teammates and cheer on from the bench. And all of those roles have immense value. And when put together, the sum of those parts leads to great success. But as a coach, you need to make sure that you're emphasizing the importance of all of those roles and that you're assigning those roles to different players so that they understand and they appreciate them. Transformation leaders use a lot of clear, positive, and direct communication. Like I kind of touched on earlier with your communication, be really intentional about how you communicate with your athletes. There are some athletes who you could yell across the court, fix this, do that, don't do this, and they'll take it in, they'll internalize it, and they'll work on it. For a lot of other athletes, though, that's not going to work. A lot of athletes in this generation don't like to receive feedback or criticism in front of their peers. So be mindful of that. If you have athletes who don't seem receptive to your feedback, it might not be because they're acting out or they're being dismissive or they're not listening. It might be that you're communicating to them in a way that they are uncomfortable with, or that they're not responding well to because they feel embarrassed or put on the spot or another negative emotion. So try to be really mindful of your communication and understand what the needs of your athletes are when you communicate with them. Show strong support for your athletes. Take an optimistic approach to their improvement. Display enthusiasm. I like to call this tool the cheerleader tool. Sometimes as a transformational leader, you've given all the information you can, you've done all the coaching you can, and you just need to take a step back and just root your players on. Just be a cheerleader is what they need from you. They don't need any more coaching. They don't need any more direction. They just need your support and your enthusiasm to be able to go out there and be inspired and motivated to accomplish goals. The next leadership style I'm going to talk about is servant leadership. So servant leadership is another very commonly practiced leadership style for coaches. And at the core of servant leadership is the idea of coaches putting the needs of their athletes and team above everything else. It's not about the coach's wants or needs. It's about what the athletes and the team needs. And, this is one I really, encourage you to kind of explore a little bit within your leadership practice, because I really think anybody who makes a decision to be a coach is at least on some small level practicing servant leadership. Because inherently to me in coaching is showing up for the learning, growth, and development of others. And that's servant leadership. You're there to help make others better and the team better, not yourself better. And there's a lot of servant leadership in that. Servant leaders model great behaviors for their athletes, like unselfishness, empathy, teamwork, listening, inclusion. And the power of that behavior modeling within servant leadership is a whole nother level, because as a servant leader, those behaviors that you model are setting a standard and expectation for how you expect team members to act. It's also creating a template for how team members can act. So if you provide feedback and constructive criticism in a certain way, you're telling your athletes it's okay to provide it this way. So inherently within that behavior modeling, make sure that those behaviors that you're practicing are how you would want your athletes to practice them. Servant leaders also work to develop and enhance leadership abilities of all team members. I think this is a leadership behavior that I think coaches do not pay enough attention to, including myself. It took me a very long time in my career to recognize how important it was for me to work to enhance the leadership abilities of my athletes. I was always very focused, especially early in my career as a coach, on enhancing my own leadership abilities because I thought the better leader I am, the more effective leader I am, the more benefit it's going to have for my team. And there's some truth in that. But the problem that I had and a lot of coaches run into is a concept that I like to call filling the leadership vacuum. So as a coach, we're kind of always coaching. If we see something wrong, we immediately try to correct it. If we see something go well, we immediately want to praise it. And while that's natural and there's nothing wrong with it, if you're constantly correcting everything, if you're constantly praising everything, and you're not allowing your team to correct each other or correct themselves or praise each other, they're not going to develop their leadership abilities because they're not having any opportunities to be in a leadership role. So if this one speaks to you, if you're interested in trying this one out, I would suggest next time you're at practice, really be intentional about finding some moments where you see something obvious happen that needs to be fixed and you don't correct it immediately. You just wait. See what happens. Give your athletes the opportunity to step into that space and constructively critique each other based on how you've modeled it, or give each other feedback, or fix whatever the play was. Same thing with providing praise. And, they may not jump into that space right away, and that's totally fine. And if that's the case, maybe you have a young team, a new team, a team that doesn't have a lot of developed leadership abilities, it's even more important to keep trying it to develop those leadership abilities. So if that's the case, try prompting them. Something that we need to correct happened on this part of the field. Who knows what it is? I promise you some of them know what happened. They're just not confident in their leadership abilities to be able to say it. But if you create that safe space for them to step into and be leaders, you'll be amazed at how quickly they'll start to ascend and take on that leadership role. So the next two leadership styles I'm going to talk about are very, very heavy in decision making, and they're very opposing leadership styles. So autocratic versus democratic leadership. So democratic leadership, very much how it sounds. Leaders are going to solicit, listen to, and value team member opinions before making team-related decisions. What this does is it can very quickly build a culture of mutual trust and respect where there's very heavy buy-in from the athletes. They have a lot of ownership in the decision-making because they took part in the process, right? That's a very, very powerful leadership tool. Getting that investment from your athletes outside of just you instilling it in them because they participated in the decision-making process can be very transformative for a team culture. Like any leadership style, there are drawbacks. And as a democratic leader, you've got to be willing to take a slower, more deliberative approach to decision-making and accept that even though you are the coach, your opinion is one of many. Now, I will caution you, as a democratic leader, you're going to solicit the opinions, thoughts, and ideas of all team members. But ultimately, it is not a democracy. So democratic leadership does not mean that you're going to solicit feedback from everybody on the team and you're going to go with the majority. You're the coach. You are responsible for making team decisions and you're responsible for their outcomes. So at the end of the day, you have to make the decision that you feel is best for the team, even if it's the minority opinion. Now, if you poll the team of 20 people and it's 12-8 and you're with the 8, you've got to align somewhere, right? So it's mostly split. You're going to align on one side. That happens, right? You might have to do a little bit of explaining, but for the most part, you could probably still maintain your buy-in, no problem, as a democratic leader. If in that same scenario, the team is 18-2 and you're in the 2, That doesn't mean that you should make a decision that aligns with what the majority thinks is right. But in that situation, if that happens to you as a Democratic leader, I would suggest being transparent in your thought process. Explaining or being willing to explain the why behind this is why I made this decision, even though it doesn't align with the majority, right? Because the worst thing you could do as a Democratic leader is make your followers feel like their thoughts, opinions, and ideas that you solicited didn't matter. And it can seem that way if you go with a minority opinion. But by being transparent and saying, I understand why everybody thought this was the best path, but based on my experience and knowledge and ideas and opinions, this is why I think we should do it this way. But I still appreciate and value everybody's opinions, even though I went with the minority choice. On the other side of the coin is autocratic leadership. Autocratic leadership, very opposing to democratic leadership. It's limited input from stakeholders. The coach is making most, if not all, team-related decisions, and there's very little feedback from team members. What this does is create a very highly structured top-down environment for decision-making. And there's very few opportunities for team members to be involved or even question what went on in the decision-making process. Now, this is a leadership style that can be very effective depending on what type of team you have. So if you have a young team, a new team, a team that doesn't have very developed leadership abilities, it might make more sense for you to be an autocratic leader, right? Because if you're soliciting feedback from people who don't have a strong knowledge base, don't have a lot of experiences, don't have very developed leadership abilities, the feedback you're getting is probably not going to be very good. And you're the coach. You were put in this position to make these decisions based on your knowledge and experience. So never feel like as a leader, you have to be more democratic or you have to be more autocratic. Think about what the needs of your team are and then align democratic or autocratic with that while always keeping in mind what you believe as a leader. Also autocratic leadership is very common in sports because we have to make a lot of quick decisions in high pressure situations. When you call timeout at the end of the game, you've got, 60 seconds to draw up a play and make a decision and get your athletes back out onto the court or the floor or the field. There's not a lot of time to get a lot of feedback, right? And then process it and internalize it, reflect on it, and then make a decision. So as a coach, even if you're the most democratic coach, there's going to be times when you have to act more autocratically. Same thing as an autocratic leader. There's going to be times where you're going to have to make decisions about things that you don't have a strong knowledge base on. So it might behoove you to be more democratic. And then the last leadership style that I'll talk about is transactional leadership. So transactional leadership is a leadership style that was more commonly practiced in previous generations of coaches and is not as commonly practiced now. But there's still aspects of it that I think can be very applicable for coaches today if they're used in certain situations. Now, the first part of transactional leadership, I think most coaches today are still practicing, which is setting clear standards and expectations up front. If you have a team meeting at the start of the year, you set out your rules, that's very transactional. If you are late for practice 2 times, you can't start the next game. That's still very common. So I think there's transactional leadership in a lot of coaches' leadership practices still. The part of it that is not as common nowadays is the idea of a contingent rewards and punishment system. So I want my athletes to do something or act a certain way or accomplish a certain goal. Therefore, I will either put a reward out there for them to chase to try to motivate them, or I will put the threat of a punishment out there to try to de-incentivize negative behaviors. As a coach, I believe there is still merit in this when coaches focus on the rewards aspect of it. In previous generations of coaches, when it was, said by the coach that you need to accomplish this goal or else you have to run or else you can't have a water break. Those types of disincentives, I think ultimately erode the trust and the relationship of coach and athlete. When you focus more on the rewards part of it and you say, oh, okay, if we accomplish this goal, then we can do this, or then we can have this, play a game, get a water break, do whatever it is. That's positive. In your athlete's mind, they're associating the accomplishment of a goal with something positive that coach wants for me, as opposed to, well, I need to accomplish this goal. Otherwise, coach is going to punish me. So I think focusing on the rewards part of it, focusing on the positives, not only can help you get better buy-in, but it also helps your relationships because now they're associating you with positive things. I don't think this is something that coaches should do often because if you're offering rewards for everything, they're devalued. But if it's a very specific goal you're trying to accomplish, the team is struggling to get, or a concept you really want to instill in them that's important, putting a reward out there to get that extra focus and buy-in can be beneficial for coaches. So in the last part of the presentation, I want to talk just a little bit about a question that I get asked a lot and I ask myself a lot, which is how do I know if my leadership style is working? So let's look at some of those questions and answers from the beginning. What's your goal for the team? My goal is for the team to have fun. I want everybody to have a great experience. And then I made intentional leadership choices reflective of who I was as a transformational leader. I got to practice early and I stayed after. I tried to get to know my athletes on a human level. I let them know things about myself so that we can build a stronger relationship that transcended typical player coach. As we go through the year and at the end of the season, I can look at those touch points. I can look at how those athletes responded to me. I can judge how the relationships that we built, how effective was that? How substantive are those relationships? Did we really build those relationships I wanted to? Why or why not? Why did I with some athletes and not others? So because you've made intentional leadership choices reflective of who you are as a leader, when you get to those kind of inflection points during the season, those reflection opportunities at the end of the season, you can look at those specific choices and see, did they help me get to the outcomes that I wanted? Where did they, where didn't they, why or why not? And that can inform your leadership choices moving forward and how you adjust them or whether you keep them the same or change them for new intentional leadership decisions. Ultimately, there is no perfect leadership style, and there's no perfect leader, right? You can't always practice the best leadership style and behaviors for your team and athletes. That's not how I want you to judge whether or not you were successful. And that doesn't mean you are failing. If you're practicing those intentional leadership behaviors and you're not getting the outcomes you wanted, that does not mean you're failing. That's part of leadership, right? That doesn't mean you made bad decisions. There's a lot of times in my coaching career where I look back and I think I made great decisions reflective of who I was as a leader in the best interests of my athletes, and I did not get the outcomes that I wanted. And then there are other times where I look back and I made terrible leadership decisions, not reflective of who I was as a leader, and in my own best interest, not my athlete's best interest, and I got the outcomes that I wanted. It is much more important to focus on the former because that's how you continue to grow as a leader. It does not mean you're failing. Your leadership journey ultimately is going to be filled with successes and failures, ups and downs, but the defining part is not how many times you succeeded or how many times you failed, but that you care enough about your athletes and team to keep trying to be a better leader. And then before I open it up here for questions at the end, I just want to leave you with just some tips for how to improve your leadership practice and abilities over time. First and foremost, be willing to critically reflect on the intentional leadership choices you made and how they directly impacted your athletes or team's ability to accomplish goals. Be really open and honest with yourself. Again, it's not about, I built a strong relationship with 7 kids, but 8 kids I didn't build a strong relationship with, therefore I failed. It's, I succeeded in building a strong relationship with 7 kids, and I need to now reflect on and figure out, how can I build that same relationship with the other 8? Be honest with yourself during challenging times and take ownership of your leadership decisions. It's a very common trope in sports that more is learned from losing than winning. And I largely think that's true. And I really believe that oftentimes more is learned about you and your leadership practice by the decisions you make during the most challenging times, as opposed to decisions you make during great times, right? What are those intentional leadership choices you make when things are the hardest or the most uncertain or there's the most unknowns? You know, those are really the ones that it's extremely hard to be reflective on because there's so many excuses that you can make, right? Well, it didn't work, but there was this challenge and this obstacle and this difficulty. But that's when you got to be the most honest and push all those excuses aside because that's where the most learning and growth comes from. Continuously gain leadership knowledge and tools that you can apply to your leadership practice. I hope that you learned some foundational leadership knowledge and some different tools in today's workshop that you could take back to your teams or organizations and see how they work, see how they feel for you as a leader. Constantly work to understand the evolving needs of your athletes, so that your leadership style and approach best meets and addresses what's best for them. This is something that is, I think, really difficult about coaching and leading and management today in any organization or team, is the needs are constantly changing, not only of your athletes or your kids, but of your employees if you're an organizational leader. And having your finger on the pulse of those needs can sometimes feel like an all-encompassing job. But that's where it really comes back to what type of relationships are you building with your followers or your team members so that you're not constantly having to figure out or ask what their needs are, that they're comfortable coming to you with some of those needs as well. Be open to new ideas about leadership practice and approaches that you hadn't previously tried or learned. Have an open mind. It never hurts to, think about a new tool or a new leadership idea and implement it into your practice or into your organization in a very intentional and specific way. I encourage you to do that. That's how you continue to grow your toolbox and figure out, how are some of these tools going to meet the needs of my athletes or my team members in a way that I hadn't thought of before. And then seek out and listen to feedback on your leadership practice from people that you trust. Everybody has leadership blind spots. Even the most honest and reflective person is still going to prioritize being honest and reflecting on certain leadership decisions that they made versus others. So have somebody who knows you, somebody who knows who you are at the core as a leader. Be that sounding board. Be somebody who can give you that feedback in those circumstances where maybe you're not seeing it the same way that they are, or maybe you're a little blinded because of your investment or because of emotion, which is completely normal. So have somebody that you can go to who can kind of help inform you on some of that leadership reflection. So that is my presentation. I will open up to questions. Feel free to email or reach out, find me on social media if you have any questions down the road or leadership problems or anything like that. My book is Lead Like a Pro, Effective Leadership Style for Athletic Coaches. I hope you will check it out. It expands on this workshop. And with that, I will open it up for any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas that anybody has.